challenging. So I do hope that when I talk, you will feel that you can interrupt via Irina, not directly. I don't know how this works, but I guess you have to go through Irina. Please ask questions at any time. I've made some slides several times during the presentation saying questions, comments, comments. And I'm very happy not only to receive questions, but also your comments, and also for you to share your experience. That would also be a real contribution to this webinar. Hopefully in a few more years, we'll be able to conduct this in a truly interactive manner. And this, I suppose you can say, is semi-interactive.
And to add to it, Olga, I'm sorry to interrupt for just a second, just to build on that. If you've done webinars before, you will know that you can type your questions in the Q&A section. And I will take a note of all of them. And when Olga pauses, I will read your questions to her. Sometimes the questions come that are not related exactly to what we're talking at now, so I will save those types of questions until the end of the webinar, but I promise that I will get to all the questions. And I'm going to turn off my video now, but I am listening and I am keeping track of questions.
All right, thank you so much, Irina. And I will then start. So Irina said that what I'm going to talk about is curricular developments for Russian heritage language speakers. You can also take it as for heritage language speakers in general, but of course now we are focusing on Russian. Irina mentioned that I'm director of the Title VI Center. The center, in case you're not familiar with it, is the National Heritage Language Resource Center, funded by the U.S. Department of Education, and it is one of 16 national language resource centers. But while at this point, I think all of the centers do some work on heritage learners, this is our mission, and that's how we got established in 2006 by proposing a center that would deal with teaching, research, curriculum development, assessment development for heritage learners of all languages. It's not for Russian, right? It's for all languages. For all, I would say, immigrant languages, we focus on immigrant, not on indigenous languages. For example, among the projects we have on our website, you can find this online StarTalk and HLRC workshop that is self-explanatory, that's free of charge. You can go into it and explore and find maybe some answers to the questions you have. I recommend it strongly. I would also like to invite all of you to apply for the StarTalk and HLRC teacher workshop. We hold it every year since I think 2009 possibly. And the goal is to bring research findings and best practices to practitioners. It's very interactive, so you meet your colleagues, which is probably the best way. And to meet people from other languages, not only from Russian. This time, the dates of the workshop it will be held the last week in June, and the application announcement will appear on our website shortly in a few days. So please watch the website, and I do hope you apply. I don't mean all will be accepted, but I do hope you apply. All right. With this, so what I will talk about, I would say that number 3 is the main point of my discussion today, is that the targeted outcomes of heritage language instruction. But I will first talk about the profiles of current Russian heritage language students in a slightly different way than Maria Polinsky talks about them. I will present some research on proficiency gains among heritage language learners, and then discuss the foci of curriculum development, And then, if I have time for that, macro-based approaches and the knowledge-based for HL teachers. If it doesn't get to that, you can have the PowerPoint and take a look at that. And Irina, are you going to time me? Okay.
Yes, I will, and I will let you know. I will let you know when it's close to an hour.
All right, very good. So first of all, you know, whenever you talk about heritage speakers, you do need a definition. Unlike when, I suppose, when you talk about L2 learners, we all understand who L2 learners are. I know that Maria Polinsky gave a definition or a number of definitions in her webinar, but I would like to make sure that we are on the same page with this working definition that my center uses, the Heritage Center uses it, also I use for this talk. So heritage language speakers are individuals who have been exposed to a particular language in childhood, but did not learn it to full capacity because another language became dominant. We all understand that. And so what this definition stresses is that these learners have some functional ability. We know in the language, at least in speaking and listening, at least in speaking and listening, all right? So we all know that there are also other heritage learners, heritage language learners. For example, as Van Dusen-Scholl defines them, learners with heritage motivation. For example, someone whose family immigrated here many generations before, and they're interested in the language because they feel that they have some roots. I'm not talking about these learners. So the learners I'm talking about all have some, at least minimal proficiency in Russian. So just to put it all on the same plate again, of course, demographics is very important for heritage. You know, that's where we have to look first. And mostly we have to look locally because the overall population, we know, if we know the overall numbers of Russian-speaking population in the United States, is just helpful background information, but it's more helpful for each of us to know the heritage population or the immigrant population in our own locale. And it's also important for those of you who need to argue to your administrations for establishing heritage classes. So the demographics of the United States at this point looks about this way. That's US Census Bureau 2012-2014, and it's over 900,000 speakers of Russian. Okay. So overall, over 21% of Americans speak a language other than English at home. It is important for us to understand that, and for all heritage language instructors to understand that their language is not the only one, and that we can share experiences across languages. And by sharing those experiences, our programs may become more robust. So the 21% of Americans who speak a language other than English at home provides an enormous pool of students who enter school with some degree of proficiency. Okay, for us, it's in Russian. And in a recent book published by the Center of Applied Linguistics, the authors write that the mismatch between demographic reality and school language offerings is significant and counterproductive. So that's what I'm trying to address. And I think that's what all of us are trying to address, how to negotiate that gap between the students we have and the curriculum that we generally offer to a different group of students, right, to L2 learners. A colleague of mine, Maria Carrera, did a study of college programs across the country. Among them, there were 36 Russian programs. So some of you must have answered her survey. And she found that on the one hand, on the positive side, many programs offer some heritage language courses. And she also commended resourceful faculty that implement heritage language specific instruction, even when the institutional conditions are difficult or do not favor such courses. However, unfortunately, there are also the negatives. There are lots of impediments to those programs. And she also noted that the mixed classes, which is a prevalent model she discovered, are not serving heritage language learners well, at least as they're currently configured. Carrera is a proponent of mixed classes. I'm an opponent of mixed classes. But even while she supports mixed classes and thinks they're necessary for administrative reasons mainly, she didn't think the mixed classes she found through her survey served HLLs well. I'm not going to talk about mixed classes today because our conversation is about a curriculum for heritage language learners specifically. But if you have some questions about mixed classes, I will be glad to answer them. So also, just from my own research, a few things. I interviewed I interviewed foreign language teachers, high school teachers here in Los Angeles, who have both heritage speakers in their classes and foreign language learners, not Russian, but the other languages. So most teachers understand that heritage language students are different from L2s. However, at most schools, curriculum is the same for both groups. And then, of course, the teachers mentioned the lack of materials and that they have very little contact with colleagues. I think that very little contact with colleagues is one of the problems. We sometimes find it difficult to decide what to do. So this kind of a webinar, of course, Irina and Evgeny, thank you. It's, I think, very helpful for all of us, very helpful for me as I'm hoping for your comments and questions. So I'm going to just go straight at it and explain the two proposals I'm going to make. One is that a heritage language program needs to be vastly different, but, and that I think is important, but no less rigorous than an L2 Russian program that we all have in our high schools or colleges. And the other one is that heritage language instruction needs to be as outcome-based as L2 instruction. All right, any questions or comments at this point?
And we will wait a little bit because it takes people time to type up their questions. Mm-hmm. So we'll wait for a minute.
Okay.
Okay, there is a question, there is a comment, I guess, from Irina Ivlieva. In mid-Missouri, mixed classes are the only option, since there is not so many of them, I assume of heritage speakers. Mm-hmm. However, initially, they intimidate many novice traditional foreign language learners, yet feel very uncomfortable themselves when it comes to the grammar. Mm-hmm. There's also another comment, general comment. I teach Hungarian heritage learners. I should have invited them as well. I guess teachers maybe of Hungarian as a foreign heritage language. And Natalia Abramova is asking, can you please tell about language proficiency test for students?
All right, I'm going to get into the tests. That's a big part of my presentation. About the mixed classes, of course, if you have very few heritage language learners, there is nothing you can do. They need to be in a mixed class. If you have a possibility of not having them take your very beginning class, that may be helpful. You know, if anyone has a very specific question, like that, I will actually be happy to talk to you later, okay? By email or we can Skype later at some point. So please feel free to send me an email, all right?
Thank you, Olga. And there's another question. Inna, could you please recommend the best Russian heritage language textbook at this point?
No, I can't. I don't think so. But let's first get through the presentation and see what I recommend in general, and then we can talk about the best possible textbook. You know, there is a limited number of textbooks. I know there is at least one more coming out right now soon, so we'll have more. But let's just get through the general principles before we get to specifics, if you don't mind. All right?
Sure.
All right? Anything else?
No more questions for now. And
All right.
Yes, it's a good idea. Let's continue.
So I'll move on. So first, a little bit about the profiles of our current heritage language learners. The first question is, are heritage language speakers the same as native speakers? And the answer is yes and no, right? Yes, because they started as native speakers growing up in a family where the language was spoken, and no, because they didn't continue on that trajectory. Another language, English in our case, became dominant after the age of 6, approximately. So if you look at this is not just Russian, it's a survey of about 1,800 students that I did in 22 languages. And you can see that between 0 and 5, most of them just spoke the home language. And then it started diminishing by the age between 6 and 12, so that's schooling, and then even more and more and more. However, so English is on the rise, right? It's blue. However, if you look at the light blue, it's both languages together, which means that the home language is, the heritage language is still used, but English is added to it. Please keep this mix in mind because it will be important when we discuss it later. So the diminishing of the heritage language, the rise of English, but then this combination of the mix, which is still present in their linguistic lives. So the next question is, are heritage language speakers the same as L2 learners? And the answer is no, but also yes. And this may be partially the answer to your question of, I can't remember, sorry, who it was, who asked whether the mixed class, where the heritage learners are mixed with beginning language learners, what do you do with them, and so on. At higher levels of language development, of language proficiency, heritage language learners need instruction similar to L2 learners. But the point is, at higher levels of language developments, Anna Kudima and I did a study where we showed that once L2 learners of Russian reach the intermediate high level of proficiency on the actual scale, they work very well with heritage learners who are at about the same level. Before that, the differences are so broad, they're so diverse, that this combination doesn't work for either group. Here is a student who wrote in answer to a survey question, my mother would speak Russian to me and I would reply in English. I rebelled against speaking Russian and against Russian culture until about the age of 17 or 18, when she decided she wanted to learn Russian and she took a Russian class. So is this student a native speaker? Is this student an L2 learner? Do you have students like that in your class? I'm sure you do. So this is in a way, one of the typical profiles of a heritage language learner of Russian. Not the only one, but one of the profiles. I've been studying demographics of Russian and other heritage learners for a few years now. In 2007-9, in the study that I mentioned already of 1,800 students, 220 of them were Russian heritage learners. 26% of them were born outside of the former Soviet Union, and 60% left the former Soviet Union before the age of 10. Now, in 2013, 2016, here at UCLA, we've been giving an online test, mostly to heritage learners, and we have the data from 81 questionnaires that they filled out. According to their responses, over 50% were born outside of the former Soviet Union. So in 07-09, 26% were born outside of the former Soviet Union. In 13-16, over 50%. So to me, that indicates a change in the generations, which would also indicate the change of, possibly the change of proficiencies. I don't know if you use those terms, if you're familiar with those terms, which are commonly used in demographics, social linguistics, that the 1.5 generation, these are children who came to the United States, could be any other country, but we're talking about US now, right? Came to the United States to live before the age of 15. So that they're known as 1.5 generation. The second generation are children born in the United States to at least one parent who was foreign born. So for us, at least one Russian-speaking parent, okay? And then there is a third or third plus generation where both children and their parents are US born, but grandparents, one or more, are foreign born. So I want to ask you a question, and I would be grateful if you can answer it. I don't expect you to actually have that information, but to have gathered that information, I mean. But from what you know about your students, would you say that a large percentage of your students is second or later generation, or do you mostly see 1.5 generation? So here is the question again. What percentage of your students is second generation? So, как вы думаете, какой процент ваших нынешних студентов или учеников родились вне бывшего Советского Союза, то есть представляют собой второе поколение? If you can jot down the answer, I just need one word, many, some, 50%, whatever you feel comfortable with, and you could send it to Irina.
And I will start reading them. I have 100% in Washington, D.C.
So you mean the second generation, right?
Natalia, could you confirm 100% of second generation?
Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
All right. So as long as you say it's clear that percentage of second generation, right?
Then I'm getting in my class, there are only 1.5 generation, that's Missouri. 100% second generation, probably 80%, 70% second generation.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them, 80 to 90%. 100% second generation.
All right, very interesting. So if you keep writing, I will keep going with this, but I would appreciate if you could just send those answers to Irina, okay?
Okay.
So Yelena Francis raised hand, that means a question or what? No?
I think these are all, yes, these are all questions, but Yelena Francis happens to say 2% second generation.
All right, 2%, interesting. What's 2%?
So what are the other?
What are the others? Right.
I will continue counting how many, what the percentage is, like you said, Olga, so you can continue and we can come back to it. But I think
very good.
We're getting the point that it's 80 to 100%.
Okay, so the reason why I'm asking, because if someone is 1.5, someone was born in the former Soviet Union, then we can assume that the exposure to language was bigger. Yeah, was more than if they were born here. And I'm going to, since I have a hunch at this point, you know, I don't yet know exactly, but my hunch is that we're getting more and more second generation students in most, not all, most of our classes. So when I talk about the curriculum, I will show you some profiles of second generation students. And that's why I'm interested whether that would be of interest to you, but it looks like to some of you, yes, you also have more second generation than anyone else. So here is a generic profile of a Russian heritage language learner that we have in our classes at this point. That student would be a second or 1.5 generation, a sequential bilingual, which means that they first speak Russian at home and then add English when they start preschool, for example. They continue to use their home language, but in limited ways. And they have heritage language specific motivations, both linguistics and cultural, which are different from L2 motivations for taking the language. And many of them have dual identities, which means they would say, I'm a Russian American, or an American Russian, or a Russian Jewish American, or Ukrainian American, or Ukrainian Russian American, and so on. I've seen all of that. So this is from a study that I did. And if you look at this, this is the Russian data. So these people would be sequential bilinguals because they started speaking just Russian. And then at some point here, 6 to 12 years old, they added English. And once again, for the Russian group as well, you see this green line, which means both languages are still in use. All right. And the heritage language specific motivations are to communicate with family in the United States, learn about cultural linguistic roots, communicate with family in a Russian-speaking country, and for future careers. And of course, to satisfy language requirement in college and high school possibly too. In a very recent study, I got those responses, why students want to take Russian, heritage language students want to study Russian, because my family has rich Russian history, because someone wants to become an ophthalmologist, interact with Russian-speaking parents, so career motivation, and then someone who summed it up by saying for language requirement, future career, and speak better Russian. Okay, so I suppose all of that. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about UCLA placement test, and I will base my recommendations for the curriculum later on the results of this test. And I will present the profiles of 4 second-generation students. That's why I was asking you about this, what generation your students belong to. So the test has been administered between 2013 and 2016. It's an online test. It comes in these following sections. There is a background questionnaire, grammar, writing, speaking, reading, and listening, all right? And so we have 81 background questionnaires, and among them, 41 are second-generation students. So I chose 4 students who seem to be representative of the cohorts that we now have in our heritage language classes. At UCLA, we have a program for heritage language learners without literacy or little literacy, and then we also have content-based courses for heritage language learners and L2s of high-level proficiencies. So here are 4 students, Anna, Julia, Daniel, and Maria. Their language use is such, as you see, Anna speaks it every day, Julia sometimes, Daniel sometimes, Maria every day, to parents, okay? And Anna studied Russian at home for 2 or 3 years. Julia went to preschool for a year and was taught at home. Daniel indicated he studied for a year, we don't know where. And Marie indicated that she studied Russian. So they're all second generation, which means they were all born here, okay? Maria had some kind of Russian lessons for 12 years, at preschool, at home, with a tutor, and so on. So Anna writes in block letters, Julia does too, but they can both write. Daniel cannot write. Maria writes in cursive, and I'll talk more about it. Okay, so this is a pretty common profile. I hope you would be able to recognize some of your students in this profile. On the grammar test, Anna got 91 and Julia did even better, and Maria did better, as could be expected, with 12 years of tutoring and so on. And Daniel got a 78, which is a passing grade, not so bad. But then on speaking, Anna and Julia are both in the intermediate range, and this was not an OPI interview. We just asked them to record themselves. I'll show you in a minute. So it's a range. I can't give you the precise results for them. Daniel is somewhere around intermediate low, and Marie is probably advanced. Now, the interesting part was the listening. We all generally expect that the listening is better for our heritage students, that this is their strongest skill, and they also will indicate that. However, we've noticed that, so Anna got only 60%, Julia did all right, and Daniel got 33% on listening, and Daniel got even less on reading. The others did fairly well on reading. So I'll show you a little bit of each of the students. So there were 2 speaking prompts. One was to give advice to a friend what clothes to pack. This is sort of intermediate, low, intermediate, mid task. And the second one was recommend a book to read, which is probably intermediate, high, I don't know, around intermediate, high, advanced level task. Okay, so let me first give you this one. I'll just let you listen for a few lines, all right? Oh, you can't hear it.
Я только что прочитал очень интересную книжку, и я думаю, что тебе очень понравится. Она романтика, но у нее тоже есть исторические факты. Там есть монстры и вампиры, и она очень страшная иногда, но это очень интересно.
All right, so let me go back to Anna and see if you can listen to that. Well, for some reason you can't, but I'll just read it to you. So, летом я читала Сирию, первая книжка моя, самая лучшая, главный характер, она была девчонка, и мне это было интересно, потому что обычно, когда я читаю книги, главный характер — это всегда мужики. And было интересно читать, and so on. So, if you look at that, one thing you can see is a mix of vocabulary, right? So she doesn't know what lexical items would be appropriate for this kind of narrative on a test. And in general, what you notice here and what you notice in Julia's recommendation of a book is that their vocabulary is limited. They can express themselves. So I think we can say this is intermediate level. We know what they're saying, right? They're just not saying it very well. And here is Daniel. Well, no luck. With Daniel, and that's why he was assessed as probably intermediate low. If you read this, it's really not very easy to understand what this book was about. So he didn't quite complete the task. He can talk, but he didn't quite complete the task. I wanted you to listen to it and, oh yeah.
Я прочитал такую книгу, называется The Choice You Make. Это книга про жизнь, про выборы, которые ты берешь в жизни, почему ты берешь этот выбор. Эта книга, у него есть реальный характер. Человек, который написал, очень умный, и он так пишет, как будто ты реально...
All right. You got that, right? So one thing, I know Masha Polinsky in her webinar talked about the speech rate of heritage language speakers, that it's much lower than native speakers. And this is one thing that I can't agree with, because sometimes they really speak fast. It's just the question of what exactly they say. So the speech rate doesn't always work as a measure for these speakers. And then finally, here is Maria, who is our advanced level. No luck. All right, you can read that. 2 года назад я прочитала очень интересную книгу, называется «Мастер и Маргарита», and so on and so on. And then I underlined some sentences to show the vocabulary she uses. В этой книге много фантазии, еще много любви и страсти. Часть книги описывает убийство, как его предали, как римляне над ним издевались. Okay? But then also, she's not a native speaker. She's not probably a superior speaker either. She says things like, Маргарита берет на себя много терпения. Okay? I love this. Начинает участвовать в колдунстве. I think it's a very nice way to form the word колдовство from колдун, adding the appropriate suffix. So, but this is clearly at least an advanced level speaker. All right. Now, the writing, I want to refer you to some research on heritage language writing. These are the dissertations that are recent enough. Geishrik, Smyslova, who writes on integrated skills, Dengub and Karkafi. So these dissertations are interesting because they explore various aspects of writing, and I recommend those. And this is very typical, right? You can't read it very well. It's not a very good copy, but there are lots of mistakes. It's block letters and lots of mistakes, okay? Here is Julia's writing, block letters, very few mistakes. It's very clean, but the sentences are very simple, okay? Very, very short sentences. And here is Maria's writing in cursive, much better vocabulary. At the same time, very simple sentences too. So even for Maria, we need to do some work on her writing and possibly on her speaking for her to get to a higher level of proficiency. So, and then I want to go back to listening. The listening text, the listening subtest was a factual description of a museum collection. So something like музей, whatever, it was Эрмитаж, or Третьяковская галерея, был основан тогда-то, кем-то, and so on. And the text is at advanced level. It's an authentic listening text. But the questions were at the intermediate level, like what, when, where. And the students didn't do so well on it. Anna got a 60%, and Daniel only got 33%. And overall, I'll first show you this. And overall, all of the students, we had 83 students who took the listening test. Only 20 of them really scored between 95 and 100%, and 19 scored between 80 and 85. But 65%, 44 of them scored 65% and below. And the mean score for the second generation was 67%. I want to draw your attention to this self-assessment because students feel typically, heritage language learners feel typically that listening is their most robust, most developed skill. This last column is as native, I'm as good as a native speaker. And the blue column is listening. So a lot of students feel that they are basically native in listening, and it doesn't turn to be out true when they take a test. An explanation provided by Maria Polinsky in the seminar that she did a couple of weeks ago is probably a very good explanation. She says that heritage language speakers understand contextually established interactions, And when faced with ambiguity or cultural references, they experience serious difficulties. I think this is vital for curriculum planning. We need to target listening comprehension and not think, among other things, of course, and not think that, oh, their listening is okay, we don't need to work on that. I'll come back to that. So the conclusions on the UCLA test is that to assess heritage language learners, we need an integrated linguistic profile. We need all skills, plus background information. We cannot just assess them. We could just ask them to talk. We could just ask them to write if they can write. But to actually place them and create a curriculum for them, we need to assess all 4 skills. And then I just want to underscore in number 2, the listening. The results don't agree with student self-assessment. So I will show you how this integrated 4-skill test can yield the results that could serve as a basis for heritage language curriculum. So I'll show you this and then I stop for questions. So this is what the profiles, the proficiency profiles for these students look like. So Anna and Julia are intermediate, Daniel is intermediate low in speaking, Marie is advanced. In listening, they're just intermediate, right? Only Marie is higher. And Daniel may be novice, it's hard to know, of course. In reading, again, Anna and Julia are intermediate. And in writing, we need to work on their writing clearly, but their writing is intermediate, between intermediate low and intermediate high. So what I'm trying to show here, that you can look at this, and let's say you have not 4 results, but 20 results, as we typically do every fall. By looking at those results, we can decide how far can we go with those students within a certain period of time, or to put it differently, what kind of a curriculum can we offer these students? All right. Cindy Martin, in a paper that I will refer to again, says that the official actual OPI remains a global functional assessment for all speakers. I think this statement applies to the other skills as well, to writing, listening, and reading. I'm bringing that up because some people say that, oh, you cannot assess heritage learners the same way as L2 learners. But actually, I think you can, if you know what you're looking for. All right, I'll stop at this point, and I hope you have some questions or comments.
Okay, Olga, so there is a comment. Could you, a question from Nadia. Could you please share your placement tests?
Yeah, we can probably share what they look like. Yeah, I can't do it right now, clearly, but I can show you what kind of a test it is. If you tell me how, you know, when I post my, Evgeny asked me to allow to post my PowerPoint, I can add a slide on what the test looks like.
Great, and Nadia says thank you. Also, I was collecting, while people are typing, I was collecting the answer to a question about second generation, just to confirm that it looks like it's, yeah, it is second generation mostly. And the person who said 2% actually meant it wasn't 2%, it was 100% second generation. There's also Izolda, who teaches mostly second generation, but also has third generation, that's Polish speakers.
I see. Okay, very interesting.
Also, earlier there was a question from Irina Ivlieva. Does it make a difference in heritage language proficiency if A, only one parent speaks Russian, and B, both parents speak the language?
You know, it may or may not. The answer probably is, oh, yes, it does, because if they speak Russian between themselves. But the situation is much more difficult, and it probably boils down to the family language policy. The family language policy, you know, it's a grand title, a grand term for just saying, so how does the family use the language at home? Do they insist on their children using the language? Are there siblings who speak English between themselves and so on? So there are a lot of questions around that. So I don't know you can just answer that question. I know anecdotally that if there is a grandparent somewhere close by who doesn't speak English, that helps. But it also helps in an interesting way. Sometimes when our students start taking Russian, taking a Russian class, then they start talking to their grandparents. And I think Irina can also show it with her webinar next time, when after a certain kind of a project, they start talking to their families more. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's a more difficult question than a superficial question. It's a very good question, but you do need to explore family policies.
Olga, I have a couple other questions that I will ask. You asked me to remind you of time. It's 4:50 now, and we're probably our time, East Coast time. Mm-hmm. We probably want to stop at 5:15 to allow 15 minutes for general questions. So just a reminder to you. And the question was about identity. To what extent do second generation speakers identify themselves as Russians? Are there any surveys on this?
I've done some surveys on this, which were the results were unexpected and interesting. Some of I remember, again, I don't have that data right now. I have it somewhere. For example, I remember a second generation student telling me, "Oh, I'm Soviet, and she was born here." What did it mean? It was, she was just an American kid. Her Russian wasn't that fantastic, but she felt that she belonged in this, I don't know what it is, that she grew up with. So I know that. I remember someone who was the second generation who told me, "I have a triangular culture. I am Russian, American, and Jewish." And the student who was very clear on his identity. So it depends. The identities are very personal. I tried to do a study once to see whether identity is correlated with proficiency, and I didn't get anywhere with it. For my study, they did not. So some students felt they were Russian, but their proficiency could be lower. Some students felt they were Americans, and their proficiency could be higher. But also, it only makes sense to talk about identities if there are other cultures around us. By itself, identity means nothing. Identity is meaningful just in a confrontation. And I don't mean confrontation, but I mean in a situation where you're confronted with several identities. So some students would say, "Oh, when I go to a Russian-speaking country, for example, I am an American. But here, if people ask me about my family, I say I'm Russian." So again, it's an interesting field of exploration. If you look in the Heritage Language Journal, there's a whole issue on identity a couple of years ago. So that may help you understand the issue.
Mm-hmm.
Could I continue?
Let me just read a couple of comments. Natalie McGregor says it is very important to start including the achievements of the Saturday Sunday schools and providing the most up-to-date curricula for heritage students. For example, to include results in middle school or high school diploma, or have special tests for heritage students getting to universities.
I agree completely. I think it's very important. I'm also beginning to see that students who go to a good, solid community school, even if it's just once a week, do come out with really different results from those who don't. So, heritage schools, community schools teach. I don't know if they're all the same, but none of us, our programs are all different. So community schools need to be supported as much as we can. There is a way to negotiate with high school districts to see that the results of communities, I think Maryland has done that. So UCLA, for example, gives some tests to students, some of them are from community schools, and they negotiate with the high schools to have them, to give the students credit. It's an administrative difficult problem, but it can be overcome, but it's local because those pedagogical or administrative decisions are local. All right, let me continue with this, okay?
Good.
Unless you have something else that you really want me to address.
No, I think we can continue.
All right. Okay, so some studies, and my own among them, show that most heritage language learners, even those without literacy, start instruction at the intermediate, low, or mid level of proficiency. At the same time, we know that foreign language learners may take 3, 4, or more years to reach intermediate mid. The studies were done in the 1990s, and then by Ben Rifkin in 2000. And we all know that, you know, students can keep taking Russian and keep being at the intermediate level. It's quite, even if they major in it sometimes. Alice Myslova in her dissertation shows that after 1 semester of instructed Russian, heritage language learners performed better on integrated tests than L2 learners after 4 semesters of Russian, and that 80% of HL students performed at the intermediate mid-level compared to 56% of the second-year students. So they are ahead of L2 learners because of their background, right? The question is, and why I'm bringing that up, is that we can build on their initial proficiency, which is sort of intermediate proficiency, but we need to know why we're building on it and what we want to achieve. Another research that shows proficiency gains, Davidson and Lekic investigated the overseas Russian flagship immersion program and found out that heritage language learners in that program progressed from advanced to distinguished, which is quite a bit. That's distinguished is the highest level on the actual scale. And the L2 learners progressed from 2 to 3, progressed from advanced to superior, which is also a high level achievement. But so to get into the program, into this overseas flagship program, you need to be at the advanced level of proficiency. So that just shows that heritage learners did somewhat better than non-heritage learners. At the same time, it was a great effort for both groups and a great effort for heritage language learners. So what I'm trying to show here, that heritage language learners won't achieve a higher proficiency unless an enormous amount of time and effort is dedicated to this. And there is also a study that was done by ACTFL and my center, which showed that Russian and Spanish heritage language speakers failed at carrying out tasks beyond intermediate or advanced levels because of the lack of formal training and lexical deficiencies. So when attempting an abstract perspective in OPI, in speaking, 71% couldn't complete it. Okay, never mind. Okay, look at this. 57% are unable to produce well-organized extended discourse, and 42 lacked precise vocabulary. And when attempting a supported opinion, 71% lacked precise vocabulary, and same percent were unable to produce well-organized extended discourse. But as teachers, we know how to do that, right? We know how to teach vocabulary. It's hard, actually, but we do know something about it. And we know how to teach discourse. So if we teach heritage learners these two things, then we may get real results. Martin, who did this study, concluded that proficiency levels increased with more contact with the heritage language culture. So that may be the answer to your question. If there are 2 parents, there is more language and more culture, right? But we don't know that. And then a greater use of heritage language in general or a mixture of heritage language and English. So when I showed you the graph that heritage learners don't abandon their Russian completely, they keep using it, but in combination with English. And we tell them, oh, don't speak English, only speak Russian. It may not be a bad thing if they use both. They are bilinguals. They're not monolinguals. They will never become monolinguals, and that's not our goal for them. And also the test takers in Martin's study who rated advanced or superior, they either spend significant time in a Russian-speaking country, either living or sojourning, that's clear, right? Or they had formal instruction in their heritage language at the college level. What I'm trying to say here, that with formal instruction, we can provide them with the real proficiency gain, not just patch some gaps in their spelling, inability, or grammar. So what they need is diverse. So what I take from this study is that, and my experience also, that heritage language learners need diverse and precise vocabulary, and that may be number one on our agenda, increasing their vocabulary, and two, they need discourse organization strategies. So the targeted outcomes to me for a class of heritage learners that start at a sort of intermediate level, intermediate range, maybe even without literacy, would be advanced level proficiency and advanced high for those who start at the advanced level. And I think I'm sure that we need to target all four skills, not just writing, as we sometimes tend to, because that's the weakest point, right? But we need to focus all four skills and integrate them. I don't know if I want to take questions here, or I'll just continue and finish. What do you think?
Let's continue and finish, and then we can take all of the questions at the end.
All right. So some details of the curriculum. Polinsky in her webinar said, lexical knowledge is a good preliminary measure of a heritage language speaker's proficiency. And she said that for heritage speakers, the range is between 30 to 70 of basic word list. I'm not sure what the basic word list is. The difficulty with measuring heritage language learners' proficiency by lists is considerable, because we don't know what list they sort of have in their head come with. Then she also said that they have systematic case errors, and there are some features of Russian that heritage language learners never learned. For example, different genitive forms or neuter nouns. And I have a question to native speakers in the audience. How do you say that много носков or много носок? So there are some questions that native speakers of Russian also argue about, right? And they may never have heard those words at home and didn't pay attention to that. So Polinsky also recommended the following, which I think is exactly what we need to recommend to ourselves when building a program. First of all, build on their existing knowledge. She keeps saying the glass is half full, and I agree with her completely. The glass is half full in their linguistic knowledge. We just need to recognize that. And then also she suggests targeting reading, which is supported by many specialists in vocabulary and development. For example, Paul Nation, who is an authority on vocabulary development. She says, learning to read expands the vocabulary, expanding the vocabulary grows better grammar, learning to read raises metalinguistic awareness. Polinsky is not a specialist on teaching, but these are common sense things that are used in teaching art, in language arts teaching, and I think we'll do well in using those principles in our teaching. So I want to suggest, and I'm getting close to the end, I want to suggest a heritage language curriculum, which I called Made Simple. I would focus on vocabulary expansion, add certain grammar points, not agonize over incorrect grammar that reappears and keeps reappearing. It takes a long time, if ever, to patch that. Then I think what's very important is to teach them, these students, pragmatic competence, because without pragmatic competence, they sound like little children addressing adults as "ty" and saying inappropriate things to people, which doesn't encourage intelligent conversation, right? And then, of course, cultural enrichment is always part of our language program. So vocabulary, Polinsky says, is the best indicator of overall proficiency. I think it needs to be focused on mostly. Pragmatics, as Ivina Dubinina shows in her dissertation, is really of essence to any kind of communication. And grammar, as Silvina Mantrul, who works in Spanish, not in Russian, says, the grammar in heritage learners is selective and localized, which means don't start teaching grammar from the very beginning, and we probably don't need to spend inordinate number of time on grammar. We need to see whether we could rearrange our priorities. And then there are some dissertations on aspects that you may find helpful. So summing up the curriculum, what I would do, I would think in terms of actual proficiency guidelines. I don't insist in any way on actual proficiency guidelines. Some people dislike them for a variety of reasons. It can be any other kinds of guidelines. But there needs to be a clear understanding of how to get from point A to point B, which means how to grow the language. And what actual or other, for example, Russian or European guidelines do, they show you how to grow the language and what to expect at every juncture. We need to have measurable outcomes. I think that probably is the issue. The issue is not what textbook to use so much and not what materials to use, but what outcomes we're hoping to achieve. And then by looking at the outcomes, we can decide what materials fit best. We, however, need to keep in mind that the home language of these students is not the educated language of Metropoli, and Masha Polinsky makes that point. But it's the baseline language of their home, which is impoverished. It's not impoverished because their families don't speak good Russian. It's impoverished because at home we don't do certain things with the language. We talk about food. We talk about when you get back from your, athletics practice. We may not discuss politics. And David Andrews, for example, showed in his book on Russian third immigration that even first-generation immigrants, educated Russian speakers, would switch to English when discussing their professional themes. So we are all bilinguals when we live in this country, and we need to understand that. We also need to remember the native-like nature of initial heritage language acquisition. They did not learn it from textbooks, so they would all be a little different. Like the student, Anna, I think, who said muzhiki, she didn't mean muzhiki in the sense that becomes funny. She just meant mushchiny or whatever, something like that. And then, of course, there is a need for differentiation because all of the students come with somewhat different proficiencies. However, I think after the first semester of Russian 1, we probably also start differentiating with our students, as some have acquired certain things and others did not. All right, and I think I will skip this. I can go back to that if anyone has questions later. And I will end with my recommendations. So what I would recommend as the guidelines for establishing or deciding on a curriculum for heritage language learners is, first of all, decide on a set of guidelines that help you set achievable goals in all 4 skills. And I know that my colleague and friend Anna Kudima would say, no, it has to be 5 skills, you have to add culture. And I agree with that, but we didn't test culture in the UCLA test, so I cannot comment on that. Then I would use the backward design to decide how these goals can be reached, which basically means, I want them to be able to do X. So what do I need? How do I scaffold to allow them to do X? So I would focus, I'm repeating myself, and I know that, but I want to repeat myself on this. Then you need to focus on significant vocabulary expansion. I think this is crucial to these students. Include certain grammar points and mainly not agonize about them not being able to be correct all the time or repeating the same mistakes. Then expand the range of pragmatics. And I say with pragmatics, typically with L2 learners, we only include pragmatics in our programs at quite a high level of proficiency, third or fourth year. With heritage learners, you can include it on day one, even with students who are not literate. You can start talking about how you address different people, what forms of address are appropriate, and what expressions would be appropriate in different situations. And then with spelling, I just thought I would bring that in because when we start teaching spelling, it's difficult to stop and it's very difficult to do. If you think about schooling in a Russian-speaking country, it takes about 11 years, I don't know, it's still 11 years, 10 or 11 years for students to learn how to spell, and then teachers complain that they can't write, they can spell. So we do need to teach writing and do need to teach spelling, but we need to limit our spelling instruction to basic rules that we feel are absolutely important and not get sort of bogged down in lots and lots of Russian spelling rules and make it difficult for ourselves and our students. I think I'll stop here and I'll be happy to take any questions or comments. I still have 2 minutes, but I don't think I need to use them.
Thank you. We do have some questions, and I invite participants to send in more questions. So we have 15 minutes for sure to discuss them. We may just take a couple more if need be.
Sure.
So there are some specific questions, such as, for example, do we teach heritage speakers effective repair strategies? How to self-correct, for example?
That's probably a good idea, I would think. Yeah, those kinds of strategies may help.
Mm-hmm. At what point?
Not only how to self-correct, also how to, all kinds of strategies. For example, if they don't know a word, how to express yourself differently, how to use the vocabulary and so on and so on, right?
Another question is, at what point may a heritage language speaker become near native? How often does it occur that an HL speaker become a native speaker after sufficient work on his or her proficiency?
Well, I don't know what a native speaker is exactly. It's a difficult question to answer. If we use actual terminology, then the highest level of proficiency is superior or distinguished. Okay, superior, and sometimes people can reach distinguished. In using the federal ILR terminology, it's 3 or 3+ or 4. I've seen heritage language learners who've achieved that. They studied Russian somewhat all their lives, maybe community school, tutoring, and so on. Then they came to us, for example, in our flagship program, and we got them to maybe advanced plus. And then they also spent a year in a Russian-speaking country, not just living there, but living with a Russian-speaking family, taking courses, doing a direct enrollment at a university and doing internships. That's the flagship program. And yes, they came back with the superior level or even higher level of proficiency. Whether that makes you a native speaker is a different question. You know, to be a native speaker, what do you need? Probably there is a book, Who is a Native Speaker, that discusses that question. It's a difficult question to answer. You know, and then I don't think you want our students to be native speakers of Russian. They're bilingual speakers. You can say we want them to be highly bilingual. That I would agree with.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. How about this question? Is it worth teaching heritage students by using classical literature such as Tolstoy and so on, knowing that half of the language that is used there is outdated and not used in contemporary Russian?
Well, once again, it depends on what your goal is. If your goal is just to make them familiar with Russian classical literature and you want them to have bragging rights and say, oh, I can read, I read this literature. If you want them to be, to gain higher language proficiency and to be able to talk about a variety of subjects, then you probably want them to read a variety of texts, use different discourses. Reading Tolstoy is certainly a good exercise and enjoyable. Hopefully it will teach them that reading Russian is enjoyable. So I don't think it's a bad idea. But again, it just depends on why are you doing it? You know, I did do that. I read War and Peace with these big chunks with my heritage language class. It can work. You know, what it gave them was kind of a general view of history and I think importantly bragging rights, because they thought, oh, now I can do that.
Mm-hmm. Continuing with the question of reading and vocabulary, do you recommend teaching vocabulary through reading for advanced heritage speakers? If so, what kind of reading? Do you recommend using poetry?
I frankly do not recommend using poetry for vocabulary development. I would recommend using poetry for development of cultural knowledge. Russians read poetry. It's one of the traditions in Russian culture, so that's a good thing. However, I think to develop vocabulary, what you want to do is to use a variety of texts on a variety of topics, which would not just be literary text or may not even be literary text, but would cover such advanced level or superior level topics as society, economics, university life, and so on and so on. So, you know, the kinds of topics that every educated native speaker is familiar with, not professional types of topics, but something we just talk about. You know, we talk about history, we talk about geography, we talk about elections, we talk about those things readily enough. We don't need to know a lot about them, but we can talk about them and understand them. So that's what I would choose. I would choose those kinds of topics that is something educated people talk about in either English or Russian.
Thank you. Isolde, who teaches Polish heritage speakers, says, I'm planning to design an online course for Polish heritage speakers. Are you aware of any advantages or disadvantages for of using technology with these learners?
I think there could be a huge advantage. Two things or three things that I can see immediately is one, that you can use a lot of reading texts, so they can read, answer questions, you know, you can scaffold it. They can if you can have, what is it called, computer adaptive technology, where if they did well on one text, they can go to a more difficult one, something like that. You can do the same with listening. That would be very good. You can actually do the same with speaking, but of course with speaking, someone would need to listen to them. On the other hand, of course, if they just record themselves many times discussing a topic, that's very helpful by itself, even if there is no one listening to them. And the other advantage, so all of this I think is very valuable. The other advantage is that it helps differentiation, because as much as we can test and place and so on, we still may not know enough about their needs. But with an online course, they may be able to find the niche that they actually is the best for them. It's not easy to construct a course like that, but I think it's an excellent idea.
Mm-hmm. And going back to the question of reading, Yelena Francis is asking, what do you think about using dual language books, films, and video episodes, for example, internet news, in class for this group of students?
I think you could. I think actually that's an interesting idea. Dual language books is a possibility. And then audiobooks is a possibility too, when they listen and read at the same time. Also, for example, with dual language books, you can use their bilingualism to ask them whether they think this is a good translation into English, for example. I assume you're talking about the Russian book and the English translation, right? So then it's a very good exercise. They can use their bilingualism to think, would there be a better translation? For example, I did a project with my class once. I was going to show it, but there is no time for it. On subtitling. So students made English subtitles for several films, documentaries. That was extremely useful for them because they understood how bilingualism worked. And also, since you mentioned that, I think translation is something that we keep forgetting about, but translation is not only a good teaching strategy, it's also a vital strategy for a bilingual life. So that sounds very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But once again, whatever you do, you need to know what you want to achieve at the end of it. At the end of, I don't know what period, because I don't know your programs, but at the end of a year, at the end of 2 years, what it is. Same way we know at the end of the first year of Russian, second year of Russian, third year of Russian, what our students are expected to achieve. We can measure it. So I think we need to do the same for heritage learners.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Olga. I think these are all the questions we had. I didn't read out loud some of the comments that people said. For example, yes, the linguistic pattern of parents is important, or if Russian only becomes the language of exploring the world and learning something that cannot be learned by means of another language, then we would not have a problem, we would have much success with heritage learners growing.
But that's, but yes, if you use Russian, you can explore things that you cannot explore in English. It's just that it may be a good idea to let your students understand that.
Mm-hmm. So these are all the questions that we had, and I'm going to thank, first of all, the presenter, you, Olga, for a wonderful webinar. I want to thank all the participants for the questions and the comments. And I want to remind just a couple of things logistically, that first of all, the recording of this webinar will be sent to everybody who registered by email. Hopefully by the end of this week, it will be available. We will continue with the last part of the webinar series on Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where I and my colleague Alla Smyslova from Columbia University will talk about our approaches that we use in our classrooms that are slightly different or different, but also are similar in some respect. And also, I forgot to mention that together with the recording of the webinar, the PowerPoint slides that Olga kindly agreed to share with us will also be sent to everybody who registered for the webinar. And if you will allow me, Olga, I'll remind participants that if you have some specific questions that you would like to ask Olga, you can email her, as she generously offered.
Do you need my email, or do you all have my email?
I think maybe you could put it in the slides that we will post and send to...
Okay, sure, of course. I think it's there. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, in that case, thank you so much for this webinar. Thank you to all the participants, and hopefully we'll see many of you on Thursday and continue this conversation.
Thank you all very much for listening. I'm just sorry I couldn't see you and, interact with you better.
Next time.
Next